Welcome to History Club for this month. I'm Jordan. For this month's History Club topic, since we are in a new year in 2021, and the 2020s haven't been going the best so far, we're going to take a look back 100 years ago to the roaring 1920s. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is the end of World War I, which happened right before the 1920s, and what the term lost generation means. So World War I ended with the Treaty of Versailles. So this was a treaty that the terms were set by the Allies, the victors of the war. So you can see here a picture of the Allied leaders meeting at Versailles, including Woodrow Wilson, our president at the time. And so since the Allies set the terms, Germany, who was the loser in the war, lost a lot of land and a lot of money. So you can see a big chunk of land that they lost here, right here, the Alsace-Lorraine region. And this is part of what led to World War II later on. One very significant thing in the early 1920s that played a factor in the election of 1920 was the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations was basically the United Nations, or the idea for the United Nations before the United Nations got started. And so even though Wilson was our president and he was very much involved in planning this, it was pretty much his idea. The U.S. did not support this idea. People didn't get behind Wilson, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. Now, as far as the term lost generation goes, now World War I, all wars are horrible, but World War I was especially horrible because, number one, there was trench warfare where they would dig into long tunnels in the ground and have to stay there in very dirty, dangerous, unsanitary conditions. You can see the pictures here. And so that was particularly unnerving. But also, with a lot of new technology came a lot of new weapons, a lot of things that hadn't been seen in warfare before. So machine guns were used more prevalently. You had air warfare being used for the first time. And then, of course, tanks were invented during World War I. And maybe the worst thing of all was poison gas. So you can see the soldiers running with masks through the gas clouds there. And you can see the effects with all these eye injuries here. So with that, a lot of the young men who went to fight in this war, they were very traumatized, and as a result, you had a generation that's a lot more disillusioned and a lot more pessimistic than previous generations have been, and thus the term lost generation. So now we're going to talk about things back home and how a new era was starting. So if you've ever heard of the term Gilded Age, we're talking about the time leading up to the turn of the century, around the turn of the century, where there was a lot of wealth inequality. You had a lot of businessmen who were called robber barons who could pretty much get away with anything. Rich people thriving, poor people struggling to survive. We're talking long hours, minimal pay, and very bad conditions. And the early part of the 20th century was a pushback against that. So in the early 1900s, the progressive era called for change. An 8-hour workday and more safe and sanitary work conditions. And other ideas came out of this era too. For example, income tax, the direct election of senators. These were ideas that came out of that era. But the 1920s sort of put a stop to that one thing you had was the first Red Scare, which was something I talked about earlier in my video on the Cold War. If you want to refer back to that for a little more information, but basically communism had taken hold in Russia and people didn't want to hear, so there was a panic about that. And there were a lot of labor strikes that led to problems around this time too. So when Harding ran for president, Warren G. Harding, in 1920, his promise was a return to normalcy. So he just meant things getting back to the old humdrum of things, you know. Nothing too exciting, but it made a lot of people a little more optimistic at the time, coming out after the war and after this Red Scare and these labor strikes. So with Harding and his successor, Calvin Coolidge, you had some very business-friendly presidents there. And so we're talking less taxes, less regulation, and we're talking about a lot more consumerism happening during this time, a lot more disposable income as the economy expanded. And a quote by Calvin Coolidge that pretty much sums it up is, "The business of America is business." So we've got a picture here to represent this sort of robber baron class of class privilege, monopoly, bribery, trust. We've got a cartoon about the Red Scare here, where you see a red person, representing the communists, trying to set an attack dog of communism on American prosperity, or attack dog of propaganda, communist propaganda on American prosperity, and American prosperity just eats them up. This is a picture of the inauguration of Calvin Coolidge, and these are some billboards, and I think it's Cincinnati, Ohio at this time, that shows just how rampant consumerism became. And so going back, these are two books that to some people represent the progressive era. So you've got The Wizard of Oz here, and some people think of the book as a metaphor where the scarecrow represents the rural poor. The Tin Man represents the urban working class, and the lion represents William Jennings Bryan, who at the time was one of the leader politicians of the progressive era that championed their policies. And you've got The Jungle, which is about bad working conditions. Now, this book, because it focused so much on the unsanitary aspects of a meat packing plant, people focused on that rather than just the conditions being unsafe. But both these are very important books from the progressive era. So we're going to go over and recover Woodrow Wilson and Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge a little. So we're going to look a little more in depth about the presidents from the 1920s. So of course, Woodrow Wilson was our president during World War I. He helped to set peace terms, which I talked about, and tried to gain American support for the League of Nations. But on a tour of the country trying to get U.S. support, Woodrow Wilson had a stroke, and he was a lot less effective during the rest of his presidency. Then you had Warren G. Harding, who was promising the return to normalcy. And this was the first president who all women could vote for. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But unfortunately, Warren G. Harding was not such a good president. He was known for promoting his friends to positions of power, and that led to a lot of corruption and a lot of scandal. The most infamous is this one, when the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, leased federal land to an oil company, and that piece of land was called Teapot Dome, and it was known as the Teapot Dome scandal. Then you have the very business-friendly Calvin Coolidge taking over when Warren G. Harding dies. So from Woodrow Wilson to Warren G. Harding to Calvin Coolidge, and that's Calvin Coolidge right there. He was known for being a very quiet man, but also very witty. In fact, there's a famous story, and we've got a little cartoon of it right here, of a reporter asking Calvin Coolidge, I bet my boss I could get at least 3 words out of you. And he replied, you lose. And so that, and you know, as I mentioned before, he was very fiscally conservative. Low taxes, less regulation, a lot more business friendly, more consumerism. Herbert Hoover, who we see right here, became president in 1929, and unfortunately for him, that's when the stock market crashed and the Great Depression hit. So we've got this little cartoon here. Trust me, prosperity is just around the corner. Man jumping out of the building, I'm ruined. Well, maybe not this one. So one of the important aspects of the 1920s was Prohibition, which passed with Amendment 18 to the Constitution. So alcohol temperance movement had begun much earlier, back in the 1800s, with the Second Great Awakening. In some states, like Maine, for example, had prohibited alcohol back in the mid-1800s. You had a lot of people crusading for Prohibition. The Anti-Saloon League, Carrie A. Nation, you can see her picture right there. She would go into, she was angry because she had a husband who was an alcoholic, and she would go into saloons with a hatchet and smash them up. You also had Billy Sunday, who was a former baseball player turned preacher, who spoke out in favor of Prohibition. There was a temporary prohibition during World War I to save grain. That was in 1917. And then the 18th Amendment passed in 1919. You had the Volstead Act, which was to help with enforcement of it. But unfortunately for the Prohibition people, it wasn't the most effective. People kept drinking anyway. And a lot of people who were willing to provide the alcohol, mainly gangsters, were able to make a lot of money off this. So you had Al Capone in Chicago making $60 million a year off of the alcohol trade. So that's Al Capone with, I believe that's his brother right there. And so making a lot of money. You had the term bootlegging for selling drinks illegally. Speakeasies were the places where you went and got the drink. And eventually the 18th Amendment would be repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933. So you can see them pouring the alcohol down the sewer, literally, right here. And this guy here and I have matching hats. So. Now we've talked about the 18th Amendment, let's talk about the 19th. That's women's suffrage, and that means women's right to vote. It's not about suffering, it's about the right to vote. So the suffrage movement, like the Prohibition movement, started back in the 1800s. A very big step in this movement was the Seneca Falls Convention in July of 1848. And you can see a picture of that right here. And they actually rewrote part of the Declaration of Independence to read, all men and women are created equal. There were a lot of famous suffragettes from this period, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who helped to organize the Seneca Falls Convention. Susan B. Anthony who came right after them. She was probably the most famous suffragette of all. That's her pictured on a $1 US coin, which is no longer made. And when it comes to suffrage, the Western states passed it before the Eastern states. So you can see an illustration from 1915 right here with Lady Liberty pointing out to the Eastern states that women should get the right to vote. And a lot of other countries beat us to it, like New Zealand in 1893, Australia in 1902, and the UK in 1918. That was thanks to the efforts of the suffragettes there, namely the Pankhurst family. Women would get suffrage in the 19th Amendment in 1920, and there was still some sexism out there, believe it or not, because after women had the right to vote, people claimed that Warren G. Harding got elected because he was the most handsome candidate. So women voted for the most handsome candidate. So we've got some more suffragette pictures right here. Help us to win the vote. Votes for women. Marching right there. And now let's talk about the flappers. So the flappers were a term for the young independent women of the 1920s. So women had worked a lot more during the war with the men overseas. So there was a lot more independence there in terms of working. And also they had the right to vote now. With mass production making cars cheaper, then that meant more mobility for the younger generation. The term flapper itself appeared right after that war, World War I. And flappers were known for doing things that were considered scandalous at the time, like smoking and drinking in public, listening to jazz music, and dancing to Charleston. They had a unique clothing style and appearance, which was portrayed through advertising, movies, and magazines. Bobbed hair, which means hair cut a little shorter. And notice that, especially with that lady right there. A lot of makeup, high-heeled shoes, and short dresses with no corsets underneath. So corsets were undergarments that held the stomach in, and they dropped that. So fashion designer Coco Chanel was inspired by flappers, and in turn, her styles inspired them. And so another person who was inspired was the writer F. Scott Fitzgerald, who we'll talk a little bit more in a bit. Also, the cartoon characters Betty Boop and Blondie Bumstead from the 1930s. You can see them right here. Betty Boop, Blondie Bumstead. They were inspired by the flappers originally. So on to the Great Migration. The Great Migration was when Black Americans moved from the South to the North, both to escape discrimination and to find new jobs. Jobs were more abundant in the North during this time because there was a lack of immigration compared to what it once was, meaning more jobs available. And also, they needed to get jobs up there because there was a lot of crop failure at this time. So they made the switch from sharecropping, living on somebody's piece of land and working it for them, to factory work. So you can see a picture of what sharecropping might look like here and factory work here. And you can see some routes taken during the Great Migration here. And there's a picture of a family leaving their home for a new one. So it started earlier than the 1920s. It started around 1910. But by 1920, around 300,000 people had moved, so it was gaining momentum as the 1920s arrived. Harlem in northern Manhattan had started out as an upper-class white neighborhood back in the 1880s, but middle-class black families began moving in the early 1900s. And that led to the Harlem Renaissance. So during the 1920s, Harlem became the center of black culture in the United States. A quote I got from the encyclopedia about how much culture was thriving during this time, it described it as from social disillusionment to race pride. So, and this movement was not limited to Harlem. That's very important to understand. It spread throughout the whole U.S. You had creative arts flourishing alongside activism, like with W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, who we'll talk about a little more next month when we cover civil rights leaders. So that's a little preview for you there. And with the creative arts flourishing, music and literature were especially important. They weren't the only ones, but they're the ones we're going to focus on today. So in literature, Zora Neale Hurston wrote some famous novels during the Harlem Renaissance. Those novels weren't actually written until the 1930s, but I thought they were important enough to mention even though they didn't come until later. But Langston Hughes's poems, those were another big thing to come out of the Harlem Renaissance. Also, jazz became the popular new music of the time, and a lot of the famous jazz musicians performed in the Harlem area. You had some famous night spots, the Savoy, and most famously of all, the Cotton Club. And you had famous performers like Paul Robeson, the great singer and actor, and Bill Bojangles Robinson, who was known for his dancing, who they became not only popular in Harlem, but also on Broadway and were Broadway stars. So now that we've talked about the Harlem Renaissance, let's talk about the music of that time, jazz music. So spirituals and folk songs from way back in the 1800s eventually evolved into the blues, and then ragtime came out of that, and finally jazz. And a lot of early jazz sounds a lot like ragtime. It was syncopated music, so it's music where the beat doesn't go where you expect it to go. It's basically what it is. With each form of these musics, they gain more energy, more momentum. Early jazz music is like ragtime, but a lot more energetic. So ragtime, that was the precursor, had started in St. Louis in the 1890s, and it had become the main music throughout the country thanks to guys like Scott Joplin, who you see right there. And then jazz came out of that from New Orleans in the 1900s. And you had a lot of famous jazz musicians coming from New Orleans. Jelly Roll Morton was one of them. He claimed that he invented jazz. Another one was King Oliver, who traveled to Chicago and became famous there. The original Dixieland Jazz Band, who traveled not only to Chicago, but to New York and even to England and spread jazz overseas. And of course, Louis Armstrong, who is probably the most famous jazz musician ever. That's a picture of him there. And with the rise of commercial radio stations in the 1920s, that just helped to spread jazz music even further and faster. And when they were playing jazz. The 1920s is sometimes called the golden age of jazz, and the 1930s is sometimes called the swing era. And a lot of the popular artists from that era, like Duke Ellington, got their start back in the 1920s. So I've got this slide here. I've named it Jazz Nobility because everyone on this slide had a first name that they were known by that was inspired by nobility. You've got King Oliver from New Orleans, who traveled to Chicago, and he was like a mentor to Louis Armstrong. I believe that's him playing up there. That's his band. You've got Duke Ellington, who started out in the 1920s and inspired the swing era in the 1930s, and Count Basie, who was sort of like Duke Ellington. So, you remember I said when I talked about the flappers that our automobiles were becoming more common. So, let's take a moment to look at automobiles and how they were changing. So they were invented by Carl Benz back in 1885, and his notable contribution there was gasoline power was replacing steam power, and he eventually took it from 3 wheels to 4 wheels. Now, they didn't become a very common thing until Henry Ford's Model T in 1908. Henry Ford manufactured his cars a lot more quickly and efficiently by implementing an assembly line process, plus they were affordable to the average person. You had General Motors starting in 1908 by William C. Durant right there. Oh, by the way, this is Carl Benz up here, Henry Ford down here. And Chevy was started in 1911, and General Motors had full control of it by 1916. General Motors introduced the electric self-starter in 1912, which replaced hand cranks, which were still used through the 1920s. You can see the man cranking up his car right there. Now, in the early 1920s, first of all, production had fallen during the early part of World War I due to less supplies. And then there was an economic slump right after the war in 1920, 1921, that era. So things weren't looking good for the automobile industry, but these companies started to change leadership and they started to make a comeback. So Alfred Sloan, who you see right there, took over General Motors and pushed it into the 1920s. You have Walter Chrysler right here, who took over the Maxwell Car Company. It eventually became the Chrysler Car Company, and those became the big three: Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. And they helped to make cars an everyday, every person thing. Also, Ford started to fall behind to these other two. And in 1927, they had to switch from making the Model T to the Model A to get back in the game. And it was a big hit. So here we can see some cars. First one is before the 1920s, the 1909 Ford Model T. We can also see the 1927 Ford Model A and a 1927 Chevrolet. Now, another form of transportation became more common in the 1920s, not so much for everyday use, but in general, which were the airplanes. Now, they were invented by the Wright brothers right here in North Carolina back in 1903. And they started to be used for air warfare during World War I. But after World War I, a lot of those old warplanes were bought and were sold and bought and repurposed, rebuilt. So you started to have passenger airlines. Started out at this time, they hadn't become the most popular yet. From 1918 to 1927, the United States Post Office delivered airmail. Also popular at this time was barnstorming, which was acrobatic stunts, aerial stunts being performed on the wings of planes. You can see a wing walker there, And these two wing walkers are pretending to play tennis right there. So a lot of airframe innovations were technological breakthroughs that made it all possible. You started to have metal used instead of just wood and cloth. You started to see navigation instruments be added, and you had a tri-motor plane, a plane with 3 motors. Henry Ford not only manufactured cars, but manufactured planes as well. And Charles Lindbergh became a hero to many Americans. He had been an airmail pilot and a barnstormer. And in 1927, he made the first solo, non-stop Atlantic flight from New York to Paris. People didn't know if it could be done until he did it. So since we are a library, we're going to talk a little bit about literature here. Ernest Hemingway, who is a novelist who we associate with the term lost generation, going back to the beginning of our presentation. So Ernest Hemingway was a lost generation type of writer. He wrote sad novels in a simple style after World War I. So that's him right there. F. Scott Fitzgerald, who remember I mentioned with the Flappers, he captured the 1920s spirit very well in novels like The Great Gatsby. You had William Faulkner, the other great writer at that time. He was from Mississippi. He wrote a lot of darker novels about the American South. James Joyce, who I don't have pictured here, wrote Ulysses, one of the first books in a stream of consciousness style. So it's sort of like goes into the character's thoughts and ways of thinking as the story is happening. T.S. Eliot, another another writer who is associated with the lost generation. He was a poet who put that despair into his poems, the most famous of which is The Wasteland. You can see him right here. Langston Hughes, from the Harlem Renaissance era, used a lot of everyday language and slang in his writings. He was also very supportive of civil rights. That's him there in a collection of his poetry. And I also included from the Harlem Renaissance Zora Neale Hurston in her book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. So movies really broke through in the 1920s. By the 1910s, full-length movies were now at full length, first of all, and they were being projected onto screens. They hadn't started out that way, but during the 1910s, they had gained that. And the production began to be centered in California, also during the 1910s. During the 1920s, movies became big money, and with a lot of increased star power, a lot of increased production, studios use star power to sell their movies. Now, of course, no sound early on, so a lot of actions and comedies, things with a lot of big movement, that was what was popular. So you can see some famous comedy stars here: Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd. These two guys were known for doing their own stunts. This is one of Hollywood's first power couples, the action star Douglas Fairbanks and his wife Mary Pickford. We've got the Gish sisters, Dorothy and Lillian, who were popular at that time. And now the next person I'm going to come to is Al Jolson. He was a Jewish singer who helped to popularize jazz with white audience. He was a big Broadway star, and he was the star of the first sound movie, which was called The Jazz Singer in 1927. The first cartoon in sound was produced by Walt Disney and featured Walt Disney doing the voice of Mickey Mouse, and it was Steamboat Willie, Mickey Mouse's debut cartoon. So here's a collage of some of the famous movies from the 1920s. some movies with Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd, Douglas Fairbanks. So some of the big stars of the time. There's the jazz singer with Al Jolson. And finally, we're going to talk about baseball. So baseball was the national pastime pretty much during the first half of the 20th century, was pretty much undisputedly baseball. So in the 1919 World Series, we're going back to just before the 20s. In 1919, it was the Cincinnati Reds versus the Chicago White Sox in the World Series. And everyone thought the Chicago White Sox were going to win. They had won it 2 years earlier. They were a great team. How could they lose? And this is a picture of colorized pictures of the 1917 Chicago White Sox. A lot of the same players were still playing for the team from that 2 years ago. But they lost the World Series, and everybody wanted to know why. Well, this guy right here is probably the reason why. His name was Arnold Rothstein. He was a gangster who made his money through running gambling operations. And people believe that he paid 8 White Sox players to throw the series. Now, they were found not guilty in a court of law, but it made their owner, Charles Comiskey, really mad. And he was known as a cheapskate, not playing. He would ask his payers to pay for their own laundry and things like that. He wasn't too happy with that outcome, and baseball wasn't too happy with that outcome. They appointed Kennesaw Mountain Landis to be the baseball commissioner. He, in the view of Major League Baseball, not a legal view, they found him guilty and issued permanent bans that damaged baseball's reputation and hurt its popularity, but it wouldn't be for too long. This is a movie that was 8 Men Out. That's a really good retelling of this whole incident. So if you're wondering why baseball's reputation didn't suffer and popularity didn't suffer for that long, it's because baseball had a drastic change in its near future. In 1920, the New York Yankees were playing the Cleveland Indians, and Ray Chapman was up to bat against Paul Mays. And the pitch hit and killed Ray Chapman. And after that, baseballs were redesigned. So these new redesigned baseballs were lighter, which means they traveled further. So this transition in baseball history is known as the transition from the dead ball era to the live ball era. And the big star was Babe Ruth. You can see him with Shoeless Joe Jackson, the top player from the White Sox team I just talked about right there. He switched from pitcher to right fielder at this time, which meant he got to play in a lot more games. You play in a lot more games at right field than you do pitching. So also he was traded from the Red Sox to the Boston Red Sox to New York Yankees. And this is an idea of how much the records changed. The single season home run total before, the record was 24, and he hit 60 home runs in a single season. The total for most career home runs was 138, and he broke that record with 714. Later on, Hank Aaron would break that record with 755, and of course, Hank Aaron passed away just a week or two ago. Now, the other stars from this era include, because Babe Ruth wasn't the only guy that had a bunch of home runs then, his teammate Lou Gehrig, who you can see him with here, and his rival Rogers Hornsby, known probably best from playing with the St. Louis Cardinals. You can see pictures of a colorized picture of him with Babe Ruth there and a picture of him right here. And so those were some of the big stars of baseball back then. And with that, I'm done with my presentation for today. But I want to know what questions you have. So if there's anything you want to talk about or discuss further,